All right. This talk's in English. This is my first Kaigi on Rails, and it's an honor to be here. Thanks so much for having me. And thanks to all the staff and sponsors. Thanks for putting on this event. It's great to be here. So my name is Zzak. You can call me Zaku or zzak. It's fine. So what's this talk anyways? First off, I'm not a Rails expert. I don't want to give that impression. I am, however, an active contributor to the project. I think that's why I was invited to speak. That might be the only reason. The contributions that I do for the project, they're not glamorous, and somehow I find a way to add some value to the project, to Rails. I focus on trying to empower others, and I try to model empathy and collaboration. So I want to give you like an abridged version of how I got here, why I'm so invested into Rails and spend so much time on this, and give you context what I've learned so far. My goal is that hopefully I motivate others here to contribute if you haven't already, and to find your own path in open source like me. So my Rails story begins about 18 years ago. I just first met Rails the summer after high school, graduating high school. And I wasn't ready for college, but I loved programming. I was working for a small shop writing PHP and a very limited subset of MySQL. I had no idea what I was doing. A friend told me in 2000, around the same time, about Rails, and I watched the DHH tutorial. I remember he said, we can make a lot of money with this, and so you should learn it. And I created a tiny CRM application for that company that we ended up selling. And for the first time, I could make something from scratch on my own. And I was making a living doing what I loved. That was the moment when programming finally started to make sense for me. Fast forward to 2012, I became a Ruby committer for my contributions to the documentation. In 2013, I attended my first Ruby Kaigi. Later that year, I was also a nominee for the Ruby Prize in Matsue. And a friend that I met at Ruby Kaigi gave me a job. I was able to work on open source nearly full time in that job, and also allowed me to move to San Francisco. My passion was finally starting to pay off. In 2015, for my contributions to Rails and Ruby, I received the Ruby Hero Award at RailsConf in Atlanta. And in 2016, with the help of Matsuda-san, I was able to move to Japan. For the next 6 years, I would work as an engineer at Circle CI. During that time, I wasn't writing Ruby or Rails the whole time, since Circle CI is all Clojure and Go. And then last December, I was laid off. After taking time to consider all of my options, something kept coming back to me. The reason I was here in the first place, the reason I moved all the way to Japan, was because I loved Ruby and the community here, and they always inspire me. I missed writing Ruby, especially I missed the friends that I made here. And it became clear to me that I wanted to go back to that and go back to my roots. So first I decided I'll take at least 6 months off and focus full-time on relearning the current state of Ruby and Rails. I wanted to treat it like it was my real job. Raising children means every minute I have, motivation is priceless, and I didn't want to waste that opportunity. So my main goal was to reinvest into Rails and become as close to it as possible. I did make an attempt to do this a couple years ago, but it was tough to juggle working full-time and having a family, so I decided to stop and put all my focus into that. But this time I had all of my 100% to give back. And this year's Ruby Kaigi was the perfect time because it's exactly 6 months after the layoff. And thanks to the Ruby community, I was able to find some freelance work on some very large Rails applications. My goal is to continue to work on Rails as much as possible, but in order to fund that work, I wanted to find the company who uses Rails a lot. Sometimes it can be very challenging to know how certain applications use Rails in the real world. So working on a job that gives me extra motivation and experience with the framework. Basically at work, I'm focusing on building and maintaining applications to work in future unreleased versions of Rails, and being able to test patches to ensure backwards compatibility. Not everything is caught by the Rails test suite. Having an application with tens of thousands of tests helps build confidence in those patches. It's been almost 11 months since I was laid off, and I wanted to give a report on what contributions I've made and how I'm working and what things I'm excited to build next. So at first, it's been a long time I'd written any Ruby in Rails, so I thought it's a good idea to start with the documentation. Looking at it with a fresh pair of eyes will help spot areas that can use improvement, and I'm also looking for ways to contribute. Documentation is always a good place to start. So after going through the Getting Started guide again, I started reading the active record guides. I spotted many inconsistencies between the API docs and the guides, as well as duplication. Mainly, I was looking to fix these types of issues, adding code examples where necessary. Sometimes there's just a wall of text and no code. I found these areas to be confusing. Reword or break up long paragraphs to make them easier to consume. And I was thinking of my non-native English-speaking friends. Just try to avoid huge walls of text in general. And add more cross-references between the API and the guides. For example, sometimes only the APIs would be updated when new features were added to Rails, and the guides would be behind. So rather than creating a commit or PR for every single change, I decided to group them into one big PR and for each guide that I went through. Thanks for the folks who reviewed those changes. Because of their size, I wanted to wait for feedback and approval before merging. I didn't finish going through every guide yet, but eventually I will do that. While I did get through a few guides, along the way I noticed many areas that could be improved. We were using invalid markdown syntax in some places. API docs were trying to use markdown instead of the RDoc syntax. And there are many common errors and inconsistencies in the documentation. For a while, I was going through and fixing all of these bugs by myself. I started to keep a backlog of all of these bugs in my Notes app because there were just too many. At the same time, I was following along the issue tracker, and I try to read every email in the Rails repository. It was a while since I contributed to the project, so I needed to relearn how to contribute. By following those emails, I could remember things like what types of bugs are being reported, and there's a lot of active record reports, and how to find bugs and fix them, and as well as who is working on what. Knowing who to ask is very helpful, and there are many active contributors. This also helped me identify bugs that I could fix on my own. Being active on the issue tracker, I was able to snag bugs that other people found but didn't have time to investigate. I would try to improve the docs, the change logs, or upgrade notes to help future developers avoid the same mistakes. Also, I'm always looking for ways to improve that experience. This came from my time at Circle CI, where we valued constant improvement and empowering others. One of the early issues I worked on was adding support to test multiple versions of Rack on Rails CI. I'd never used BuildKite before, so this was a great introduction for me. I could provide a way for Rack maintainers to add support for Rack 3 in Rails and ensure backwards compatibility. Another came when DHH added the Docker file to Rails new, which I could also solve using CI. We wanted people to try this new feature and give feedback, but the problem was because it was under a lot of change, it would break, and we didn't know unless somebody tried it and reported. I wasn't sure how to make that work on BuildKite, so I started a proof of concept using GitHub Actions. We ended up using Podman instead of Docker because we're able to mount things at build time. In order to mount the Rails checkout into the application without making code changes to how Railties generates the app. One of the goals Matthew had for this was explicitly to not make any code changes, or to create a path specifically for testing that wouldn't be testing the thing developers actually use. If you don't know, Matthew is a core member and lives in Australia working at GitHub. Previously, he worked at BuildKite, and he's helped me and mentored me a lot on my work on the CI. So with the Dockerfile integration test in place, we know if any PR will break that workflow, but not everyone cares about PR status checks. Some committers push directly to main. Matt says. And they might not realize they broke the build. So we have these build notifications in Discord, but only for BuildKite at the time. So I wanted to create that same experience for our new GitHub action workflow. So I made an action. The last PR was the first time that I used actions, but this was a chance to kind of build on that and learn more about GitHub Actions. Although these weren't glamorous features that Rails that everybody blogs about, I was still able to improve the tooling and processes. Meanwhile, that backlog of documentation bugs is still growing, and I wanted to do something about it. So it turns out there's tools for consistency in a software project, and they're called Linters. So first I added Rubocop MD, and basically this allows us to enforce the same code guidelines as the Rails code base to the documentation. Rails has been using Rubocop to ensure this to the framework itself. And now we can apply those same rules to the example codes in the documentation. The next tool I found is called Markdown Lint. This will validate Markdown files to a set of rules we decide. The goal is to apply the same set of guidelines that would reduce friction when reviewing PRs to the guides. These rules could be adjusted in the future. For example, line length is a big one, but I wanted to keep the diff small and the PR easier to review. I also didn't apply these rules to changelogs. Changelogs use a different syntax than pure Markdown, and RDoc has a built-in changelog parser, so maybe there's a way to build a linter out of that. Now that we have these tools in place, I could spend less time reviewing PRs and trust that contributors know how to fix them eventually. That backlog will get smaller. Basically, I really value others' time and contributions, and I want to make that as efficient as possible. And empower them to write consistent docs that doesn't depend on me to review every change. I don't want to be a blocker. I even got approval from DHH to remove copyright years, so we don't have to waste time updating that each and every year. There are many examples using these tools where we'd find a bug in CI and fix it, or at least report the issue, so that contributors aren't wasting their precious time wondering why their tests are failing and the PR is red. More recently, I was spending some effort to make the stable branches perform better in CI. I focused on backporting flaky test fixes and other bugs that we missed. Not every bug fix is backported immediately, and Discord notifications for failed builds on the stable branches is pretty new. So the team simply didn't know how bad a shape they were in. This is somewhat of a concerted effort from various contributors to make these branches green. While it doesn't directly prevent the core team from releasing Rails, it does help build confidence. This applies to other contributors as well. When they want their bug fix to be backported, they'll open a PR by themselves. And if CI is unstable, they'll probably end up wasting time there. By this time, I started working as a consultant, and we were working to upgrade through the Rails 7 series, and we ran into some trouble. Perhaps you also ran into these. They broke many tests in our CI, and after discussing with Matthew, he was against changing this behavior, which had existed for a long time. So after submitting the revert PR, it was merged, and the following release of Rails included this change. It's unfortunate that the behavior changed between patch levels back and forth. Hopefully you're able to revert those changes if you already upgraded your application, and if not, you should have a smoother upgrade path. I want my applications to test the edge of Rails and detect these problems sooner. These types of changes can be difficult to manage, which one person thinks is a bug and tries to fix, could potentially break some application which was depending on that behavior. Even though Rails has pretty good test coverage, the applications that use Rails do not report breaking changes immediately like our CI does, unless somebody reports the bug. I think that because GitHub and Shopify have always hired the most core members and committers, they use their application as a test bed for Rails features and bug fixes. Those patches eventually get upstreamed to Rails, but not always. Many applications carry monkey patches to enable upgrading to newer Rails. Over time, these can actually make upgrading harder. I'm sure you've all experienced that. If possible, I always recommend sticking to the defaults that Rails provides. That way, we can ensure your application's upgrade path is smooth, and you can take advantage of the efforts of the Rails team. Especially try to avoid patches or gems that depend on private API, since those API can change or break without notice. I'm looking at you, Ransack. Continuing my journey, I want to further deepen my knowledge of the framework. Until now, I've been working on small fixes here and there, trying to improve our tooling and save time. But ultimately, my goal is to gain a full understanding of Rails. While reading the issue tracker and fixing low-hanging fruit, there's still bugs that I struggle with. There are bug reports that it would just take more time than I have, to be honest, and I want to slow down and take time to understand those hard problems, because I'm starting to learn what I don't know. In previous jobs, pairing would always help me here. Matthew and Jean, who are able to pair with me and guide me, I've been able to work on some PRs with them. For example, we disabled prepared statements when using query logs. If you aren't familiar, prepared statements allows the server to cache the query execution plan. We extract parameters from the query and save it in the database. Then the next time the same query comes in, we just ask the database to execute that query with the given values. And query logs basically add an extra logging to every query to include controller, action, application reference to make debugging these queries easier. These two features don't work well together because the query logs increase the cardinality of every query, making them not as valuable to cache. The next PR we paired on was a refactor to the schema cache in Rails. This is a feature that I had never used before, so it was a very good learning experience for me. And Jean was very generous to explain things along the way. And basically, this schema cache is an optimization to avoid querying the database for all of your table information on boot. When you have hundreds of application servers all querying for the schema at once during a deploy, it can put a lot of load on the database. I think because I've been contributing to Rails for a while now, and there's an active Discord with members of the core team, they're more approachable to me. And I'm really grateful to get to work with them. They always provide excellent feedback and teachings. And if I can, I always want to repay that favor in the future. So if you want to pair, please just ask. Another resource I recommend watching is some talks on YouTube. I've collected a list of some good ones. They cover topics like how to debug the framework, writing patches and tests, as well as the internals of Rails like Active Record. Recently, I've been busy with work and other time investments, so I admit I'm not reading every issue or PR as of late. At the minimum, I do read This Week in Rails. If you haven't heard, you can subscribe online at Hey World to get it in your inbox. We also publish the newsletter every time on the rubyonrails.org blog. And there's a Japanese version which translate the newsletter as well as other Rails news. Thanks for them for always providing that service. This week team in Rails team includes Greg, myself, Greg, Woj, Emmanuel, Vipul, Amander, and Xavier. Since joining the team, I've written over 10 editions of the newsletter. And I'd like to share how we write it in case you'd be interested in joining the team. We coordinate the schedule and discuss drafts and review on Basecamp. When it's my turn, I collect the interesting PRs from the last week and then write a draft blog post on the website. Once that's merged, I copy the HTML and paste it into hey.com. And then I click publish and email it to the subscribers. Finally, I ping Amanda, who will post it on social media. So there are a few ways to find updates. We generally include updates in the Rails project, but we also try to include major changes in these other repos as they affect Rails. Initially, I would read the Git log. You can also include the patch flag to get the full diff. Eventually, I made these functions, and I think this only works with GNU date. There's also, I would review PRs on the GitHub UI. I found this search query to find all of the merged PRs very useful. And then I knew how many pages I had to review. There's also a hidden activity feed on GitHub. Raphael told us about this, so maybe that's useful as well. But once you've collected the list of interesting changes, it's time to write the post. Originally, what the team did was they'd write the draft in Hey, and then they'd import it into the blog using this script. When writing the newsletter, there's a few rules we have to follow. First is to write a quick intro and link to your GitHub or social media account. Each entry starts with a link to the PR. Then the link should only contain the description of the change. Then write a small summary of the change directly below that link. Lastly, we have a link to the full diff for the week and a link to the list of contributors for that week with the total count. We also explicitly try to avoid mentioning any names in the newsletter because we don't want other contributors to feel left out. It's hard because I don't want other contribution to seem less important, but sometimes it feels good to show gratitude to someone contributing a lot of their hard work, is volunteering their time. You may notice there's a lot of steps involved here, and having to do this every time is time-consuming and exhausting. I don't want to give up writing the newsletter because I think it's important to keep me in the loop on everything. In order to try to make that process as efficient as possible, I wrote a new script. And this time, starting from the GitHub blog repository, it imports the generated HTML and then import the generated HTML to Hey World. That way we can generate the footer links dynamically. It grabs all of the merged PRs in the last week using that same URL as before. And then using the GitHub API, it grabs the PR title and description. This code can definitely be refactored, like to use OctoKit. At the time, I was being lazy and I wrote my own pagination for the GitHub API. The template even generates a brief introduction with the user and GitHub profile URL, and then writes that new blog post to the Jekyll project. Then all I have to do is edit the post, removing irrelevant or non-interesting PRs, and update the content when necessary. And the process still takes me a while, but what used to take an entire day I can now do in a couple of hours. So now you can join the team, or you can start your own regional version. Next, I want to talk about Rails CI. Recently, I worked a lot on it and in the process of a big refactor. Surprisingly, there are a few people who know how it works and how to maintain it. So I wanted to share what context I've learned on that. Before I start, though, I really want to thank BuildKite for all of their support. They pay a considerable amount of money every month to host these VMs that run every build on Rails CI. It adds up to nearly 100 on-demand machines on AWS, and I know it's not cheap. Their support team is also very responsive when I run into trouble, so thank you so much. Okay, so what happens when you first push your changes to GitHub is that a webhook is sent to BuildKite, and then the pipeline will run on that repo. And BuildKite will run the config inside of the .buildkite directory inside of that repo. This is the typical BuildKite workflow. However, Rails doesn't have a .buildkite directory. The configuration is actually extracted to this other repository, BuildKite config. And the reason for this is Matthew wanted to support multiple versions of Rails at once. If the configuration was committed directly to the repository, we would have to backport every single change to all supported branches we wanted to run in CI. Basically what happens here is when the pipeline is triggered, the workspace clones the Rails repository and then clones the BuildKite config repo into that .buildkite directory, and then runs a Docker container to generate the rest of the pipeline configuration, and uploads that generated pipeline using the BuildKite agent on the host. All of this is defined in the BuildKite UI, what we call the initial steps. This file is checked into Git so we can review and collaborate on changes. The rest of the pipeline is generated by this file. This script is designed to just output a YAML of the configuration we want to run. This includes defining the build jobs for every supported Ruby version and a map of all the jobs to run each framework. If you look at a build, for example, you'll see the following at the top. First is the blue circle, which is the pipeline generate command. And then there is a build group for each Ruby version. And then there's a group for each version of Ruby for all of the frameworks. Each step will run inside of Docker using Docker Compose, where all the necessary services are available. For example, Redis or the database we're testing. If we look at the active record SQLite 3 step, Docker Compose will run this rake SQLite 3 test command inside of the active record directory using that Ruby 3.2 image. The SQLite 3 test task is defined inside of Rails under the active record rake file. One downside to the system is in order to make changes to the CI, there's probably two places we need to change. For example, when adding support for Rack 3 to CI, I had to update Rails to support bundling a version of the Rack gem via environment variable. Then I needed to make the pipeline generate script support setting this environment variable and define new steps to run Rack version 3 for Action Pack and Railties. Many of the core team complain about this because it's not easy to debug, and trial and error based means you make a lot of commits and push to get it right. This often results in breaking other parts of the CI unintentionally, which can be confusing to contributors when their PRs are failing for unknown reasons. In order to reduce this friction and make changing the CI easier, we've introduced a few things. The first is the config diff tool. Since the pipeline generate command simply dumps a YAML structure of the pipeline, we can compare them as strings. When submitting a pull request to BuildKite config, a CI job will run which checks out your code and runs pipeline generate on it, and then again on main branch to compare. It will then write this output as an annotation on the build for us to easily review. We also kick off a build using that pipeline against Rails main and the last stable version. These run in a separate pipeline from the main Rails pipeline to avoid sending any unnecessary notifications or confusing other contributors. Each build also requires a committer to approve before running the config, in case anyone is trying to abuse our CI to mine cryptocurrency. This actually happened the other day. Thankfully, that button saved us. Still, there's times when you need to run these commands locally, and I want to show you how to do that. Basically, there's two things you need. A clone of Rails and a clone of the BuildKite config repo inside of the .buildkite directory of that checkout. then you can run commands simulating the CI environment. For example, this will let you run the SQLite 3 tests on your machine. And that's it. Now you can help contribute to the Rails CI. There's two reasons I'm focusing on this. Working at Circle CI for 6 years, I have a lot of experience working on those environments. And there's a particular project I want to use Rails CI for. The main one being I want to change how we build the API guides and the documentation sites. Currently, they're running on the old DigitalOcean server with a webhook that's sent from GitHub whenever someone commits to Rails. This triggers a script to rebuild the documentation, which is served over Nginx. While this system has worked great for many years, it does have issues. It can break, and when it does, only a few people with SSH access can fix it. I want to modernize this system and also plan to migrate the documentation under the top-level domain. And then I want to set up a CDN so the docs are incredibly fast for our readers in Japan. Before building these new features into BuildKite, though, we want to refactor the pipeline generate code to be easier to maintain. There's a project called BuildKite Builder that's created by Gusto. BuildKite Builder allows you to define your pipeline using Ruby. While we already use Ruby, but this way we can write it using their DSL and dry up the code a bit. I've started a proof of concept, and I hope to have a PR up soon. Okay, if I have time, looks like I have time. There's a few more quick things I want to go through. First is bug report templates. These are a great way to share reproduction test cases. You see these a lot in Rails issues. I use them in my day-to-day for debugging as well. It's really easy to get a small patch or git bisect a bug with them. By the way, you should really learn git bisect. These bug report scripts also run during the Rails CI. And this step can fail occasionally, which is a unique place to find bugs in Rails that aren't caught by the test suite. The next thing I want to introduce is namelist. Namelist is a new internal rake task for Rails. This is actually a side project I paired with Matthew on during Ruby Kaigi. Basically, if you look at the API docs site and search for this class, you can see the same set of classes. We use RDoc to generate the classes and methods for this documentation. And so private methods and no-doc classes are excluded. In principle, anything documented is considered public API. Therefore, any changes or removals require deprecations and flags. The idea for namelists is that we have this list of all the public namespaces in Rails, sorted and organized by framework. And we can use that information to audit the public API and determine which namespaces we could change. Another idea is to use that list to generate a diff of the API. For example, we could publish a comment on each PR that introduces or removes a namespace or methods. That would make reviewing and auditing large PRs much easier. We could even use that to generate a diff between versions of Rails and know when a method or class was introduced. This information could also be displayed on the API docs site. Last thing I just want to mention is changelogs. This is a common problem with many PRs. And since there's only one changelog file per library in Rails, it's easy to go stale, and we waste a lot of time asking people to rebase. Some core team don't wait and just rebase and commit by hand. And there's an internal proposal to adopt the changelog policy like Rubocop. Each changelog entry is basically a separate file, so merge conflicts basically don't happen. And Rubocop has a rake task for merging and generating the changelog file for releases. I love this idea, and I think it'll save people a lot of time, so I may work on this next. That is all the slides for this talk. Please let me know if you have any questions or interest in learning more about this stuff. Thanks so much.